Rebecca Matthews woke up early that morning, the familiar hum of Washington's bustle seeping through the window of her modest apartment. A former military officer turned congresswoman from Florida, she had learned to juggle long meetings and travel without flinching, but today felt different. She was preparing for a speaking engagement at a progressive university in Oregon, an event that she had agreed to attend despite the growing controversy around her. Her phone buzzed, and she quickly glanced at the message from her assistant. Protest planned for your talk today. Student groups are organizing against you, Rebecca. The crowd might be hostile. Rebecca didn't flinch. She'd faced hostility before, during her time in the military, during her years in politics, and she knew the drill. It wasn't the first time she'd had to stand firm in the face of opposition, but this was different. This was a university, a place that valued freedom of thought and expression, or at least it was supposed to. The idea of being protested by students, especially ones who had never truly experienced the hardships of war, weighed on her. She spent the morning in meetings, mentally preparing herself for what was to come. Her stance on issues like abortion, military intervention, and fiscal responsibility were well known, but she was stepping into a lion's den today. The students at the university were outspoken, and their anger was palpable. Yet, Rebecca wasn't going to back down. She believed in dialogue, the kind of dialogue that could heal divisions, even if it meant facing ridicule and dissent. She boarded the plane, the sound of the engines drowning out her thoughts for a moment as she sank into the seat by the window. She pulled out a small notebook and began jotting down the key points she intended to make during her speech. The plane dipped slightly, catching her attention. She glanced out the window as clouds parted and sunlight streaked across the horizon, illuminating her path. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Stand firm, Rebecca. Life won't always be fair, but you fight for what you believe in. Rebecca smiled slightly at the memory. It had been her father who had raised her with the belief that standing up for what's right was never easy, but it was always worth it. As a veteran of the military, she had seen the harsh realities of war, the sacrifices made, and the importance of preserving peace. The coming debate would likely be contentious, especially given the university's left-leaning reputation. But she was ready. She was prepared for the difficult conversations that lay ahead. And then, the plane touched down in Oregon, its wheels screeching against the runway as if signaling the beginning of something much larger than herself. The time for preparation was over. The flight from Washington to Oregon was long, but Rebecca didn't mind. It gave her time to reflect on the past, to sift through the emotions that she'd learned to suppress. The window seat was a blessing. She needed the solitude. She had spent so much of her life in the company of others, either fighting in distant lands or leading political battles that seemed never-ending. Now, here she was, on the brink of another challenge, another protest, another audience that might never understand her. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting her thoughts wander back to Afghanistan, to the dust-choked air and the sound of gunfire that had become all too familiar. She remembered a young boy she had helped evacuate during a mission. His wide eyes filled with fear, the dirt streaked across his face. And the soldier beside her, a comrade, someone she had shared countless battles with, who had sacrificed his life to save that child. The pain still felt raw. Rebecca gripped the armrest, breathing through the ache that came with those memories. Her time in Afghanistan had shaped her, not just as a soldier but as a human being. It had instilled in her a sense of duty to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But it had also opened her eyes to the harshness of the world. How quickly things could go wrong, how often good intentions were overshadowed by flawed policies. Her fingers twitched with the urge to jot down some notes, but she stopped herself. She needed to clear her mind. She thought about her father again, how he had always pushed her to think critically, to understand both sides of an issue before drawing conclusions. She had learned early on that the world wasn't black and white. Life was complicated, messy, and so, her views, as controversial as they might be, were shaped by real experiences. She wasn't some ideologue, disconnected from reality. No, she was someone who had seen the ugliness of the world, the true cost of conflict, and the moral ambiguity of every decision made in the halls of power. Rebecca opened her eyes and looked down at the notes she had written earlier. She had planned her speech carefully. She was going to talk about the importance of free speech, about how the ability to disagree respectfully was at the heart of any functioning democracy. But she knew the students at this university might not be interested in listening. They had their own ideas, their own sense of justice, and those ideas didn't always align with hers. As the plane descended toward the airport, she prepared herself for what lay ahead. The protests would be loud, they would be disruptive, but she would face them. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't going to let the fear of confrontation dictate her actions. Her heart beat with a mixture of anticipation and resolve as the plane touched down. Rebecca Matthews stood up from her seat, collected her things, and headed toward the door. Outside the terminal, the protests had already begun. The chants were faint at first, then grew louder, their intensity increasing with every step she took toward the waiting car. But she didn't hesitate. This was what she had come for. To stand in the fire of criticism and emerge with her integrity intact. As she climbed into the car, her eyes scanned the faces of the protesters. Young, mostly, full of energy, perhaps filled with passion but lacking the wisdom of experience. They had their convictions, but Rebecca had hers, forged in the fires of battle and tempered by the lessons of time. The car sped off toward the university campus, and Rebecca knew that the real test was about to begin. The campus loomed ahead as the car navigated the narrow streets of Oregon's college town. Rebecca could already see the clusters of protesters gathered outside the university gates, their chants reverberating off the stone buildings. Signs waving in the air, students shouting slogans that branded her as everything they opposed. She knew what awaited her, and yet, it didn't lessen the weight in her chest. As the car slowed, campus security arrived on the scene, flanking the vehicle with their presence. The lead officer, a tall man with graying hair, opened the door and leaned in to speak with Rebecca. "Ma'am, you should know that the protesters have been more vocal than we anticipated. Some of them have become quite aggressive. We've set up barricades, but we'll need to escort you to the auditorium immediately." Rebecca nodded, her expression unwavering. "I'm here to speak, not hide. Let's do this." Her voice was calm, but beneath the surface, a current of anticipation ran deep. She wasn't afraid. She had faced worse in her life. The hostile environment she was about to enter felt almost like another deployment, albeit with a different kind of enemy. The tactics may be different, but the resolve remained the same. She would face whatever came at her head-on. As the officers flanked her on either side, Rebecca exited the car and made her way toward the entrance of the building. The air was thick with tension, the chanting louder now, an almost tangible buzz in the atmosphere. Some protesters shouted insults, while others waved their hands in disapproval. It was as if the entire campus had become a battleground of ideologies. Rebecca's mind sharpened. She had expected this, but it didn't make it any easier. She was here to make a statement, to show the students that even in disagreement, civility could prevail. She had come to offer them something they might not have considered. An open invitation to listen, not just to respond. The closer she got to the auditorium, the more intense the atmosphere became. There were groups of students standing in clusters, blocking the main walkway, making it difficult to pass through. One student, his face painted with anger, stepped into her path and shouted, "You don't belong here, Matthews. We don't want your propaganda." Rebecca didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eye and said, "I'm not here to force anyone to agree with me. I'm here because I believe we should be able to talk, even if we don't like what the other person has to say." "Is that so hard to understand?" The student, caught off guard by her steady gaze, hesitated. His anger faltered for a brief moment before he turned and walked away. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. As she continued toward the auditorium, she reminded herself to keep her emotions in check. Today was not it. The auditorium doors swung open, and Rebecca was immediately hit by the noise. The room was filled with over 500 students, all murmuring in anticipation, most of them staring at her with visible disdain. The stage was set, the lights blindingly bright, and the air felt heavy with expectation. It wasn't a warm welcome. It was a battlefield of ideas. The dean, a middle-aged man with a serious face, stepped to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention. Please welcome Representative Rebecca Matthews." There was a moment of silence before scattered boos filled the room. A few students even stood and turned their backs to her. Rebecca swallowed the knot in her throat. This wasn't easy, but she had expected nothing less. She stepped up to the podium, her movements calm but deliberate. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the sea of faces, all waiting for her to speak. "Thank you for having me," she began, her voice steady and strong. "I know I'm not here to be popular. I know that many of you may disagree with me, and that's okay. In fact, I encourage it, but I want you to hear me out." The room grew quieter, but the tension remained thick. Some students looked skeptical, others merely bored. But Rebecca wasn't fazed. This was what she'd signed up for. "I'm here to talk about something very important, something that, regardless of where you stand on the issues, I hope we can agree on. And that's the right to free speech. The right to speak our minds, even if those words don't fit into a comfortable narrative. Even if they challenge the status quo." She paused, scanning the room, letting her words settle. We live in a time when open dialogue seems to be disappearing. It's easier to shout down someone you disagree with than it is to sit down and have a real conversation. I'm here today because I believe that, no matter how much we disagree, we must talk. Not yell, not shut each other down, but listen. A young woman in the front row stood up, holding a sign that read, "My body, my choice." She interrupted Rebecca, her voice sharp. "How can you talk about listening when you actively deny women their right to choose? You don't care about my body, my autonomy. You just want to control us." The interruption hit like a sharp slap, and the room grew tense again. Rebecca had known this moment would come. The abortion debate had been a topic of fierce controversy, and it was one of the most divisive issues in American politics. Rebecca took a deep breath. She had prepared for this, but the pain that came with this conversation, the pain of knowing that people saw her as an enemy rather than a fellow human being, was still real. "I believe," she said, her voice unwavering, "that life begins at conception. It's not a stance I take lightly, but it's one that I believe comes from a place of compassion. It's not about controlling women's bodies. It's about protecting lives. The unborn deserve a chance at life, just like you and I." The room erupted. Some students clapped, some booed, and others shouted insults. But Rebecca stood her ground. She wasn't going to be intimidated. This wasn't about silencing anyone. It was about making her case with respect, no matter how loud the opposition got. She continued, her tone calm but firm. "We may not agree on this, and that's okay, but I want you to hear me out. Let's have a respectful debate, not a shouting match." The young woman who had interrupted her sat back down, her arms crossed, her face hardened. But Rebecca could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes. Maybe she wouldn't change her mind today, but the seed of dialogue had been planted. And that, Rebecca knew, was where the real conversation began. The tension in the room was palpable as Rebecca locked eyes with the young protester who had challenged her. The student's defiant expression, her body language closed off, reflected the deep divide on the issue of abortion. But Rebecca was prepared to meet the challenge, not with anger or defensiveness, but with calm conviction. "I understand your anger," Rebecca began, her voice carrying across the auditorium. "I understand why this issue stirs such strong emotions. Abortion is a deeply personal topic, and each side has its reasons. But I ask you, instead of reducing the debate to an emotional outburst, to consider the life of the unborn child. What happens to them? Who speaks for them?" The room fell silent. Every eye focused on her, waiting for the next word, the next argument. Rebecca took a step forward, her gaze sweeping over the students in the audience. She could feel the weight of their judgment, but she wasn't afraid. She had fought on far more dangerous battlefields. This one was a war of words, and she knew how to wield them. "It's not just about women's rights," she continued, her voice steady. "It's about the right of an unborn child to have a chance at life. It's about the sanctity of life. Yes, we must protect women's rights, but we cannot ignore the fact that every life matters, even those that can't speak for themselves." The student who had interrupted her scoffed, shaking her head, but Rebecca continued, not backing down. "I know some of you disagree with me, and that's okay, but I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to tell you that we can have this conversation without resorting to hatred, without shutting each other down. A murmur spread through the crowd as Rebecca's words sank in. Some students were visibly uncomfortable, others were shaking their heads, but the message was clear. This was a debate that required more than just slogans and protests. It required empathy, understanding, and most importantly, respect for differing views. Rebecca paused, letting the weight of her words linger in the air before turning to the next point. This is what I mean by free speech. We must allow ourselves to disagree, but we must do it in a way that leaves room for growth. We don't silence each other. We engage. A few students, sitting near the front, seemed to have softened, their expressions thoughtful. It was a small victory, but it was one that mattered. It wasn't about changing hearts in a single debate. It was about planting seeds. And Rebecca believed in the power of dialogue to cultivate understanding, even in the most unlikely places. Before she could continue, another voice cut through the silence. This time, it was a young man, his face flushed with frustration. What about student debt? You talk about rights and life, but what about the debt we're drowning in? How are you going to fix that? The question landed with an almost painful thud, and Rebecca took a moment to collect her thoughts. The issue of student debt was a significant one that had been plaguing young Americans for years. It was a topic Rebecca had grappled with during her time in politics, and it was one she knew could not be solved overnight. But that didn't mean it shouldn't be addressed. I hear you, she said, her tone sincere. I know that student debt is a burden, one that weighs heavily on your generation. And yes, it's a problem that needs real solutions. But I don't believe in quick fixes. I don't believe in handing out freebies that will only push the burden onto future generations. The room grew restless, some students murmuring in disagreement, but Rebecca stood firm. We need a sustainable solution, something that offers relief without creating long-term damage. I believe in programs like service exchange programs, where students can work in areas of need, whether it's teaching, healthcare, or community service, in exchange for debt forgiveness. This way, we're addressing the issue of debt while also investing in our communities. She could feel the weight of their skepticism in the air, but she continued. We also need to focus on making higher education more affordable, and that means tackling the root causes of the cost increases. Universities need to stop prioritizing luxury facilities over education, and we need to encourage innovation in education, such as more vocational training, apprenticeships, and online learning options. Some students seemed intrigued by the idea of service exchange programs, nodding slightly, while others remained unconvinced. Rebecca was undeterred. She wasn't here to win a popularity contest. She was here to challenge ideas and offer practical solutions. I know it's not an easy fix, she said, her voice softening, but nothing worth doing is ever easy. We need to face the reality that the solution to student debt is going to require hard work, compromise, and creativity. And it will take all of us working together to make it happen. A few students, some of whom had been hostile at the beginning, began to nod in agreement, as though they were starting to see that Rebecca wasn't just some politician spouting empty rhetoric. She had ideas, real, practical ideas. And that, perhaps, was the first step toward bridging the divide. Rebecca finished her remarks on student debt and education, and as the conversation moved on to the next topic, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. There was still much to be done, but the seed of mutual respect was starting to take root. For now, that was enough. As the debate raged on, the topic shifted, and Rebecca knew what was coming next. The professor from the Environmental Studies Department, Dr. Linda Sharp, stood up, her eyes sharp with intent. She raised her hand, and the room quieted. Representative Matthews, she began, you've spoken about a gradual transition to renewable energy, but given your voting record on policies involving oil and fracking, how can you claim to care about climate change while supporting industries that are contributing to its destruction? Rebecca could feel the weight of the question, but she wasn't shaken. She had prepared for it, as she had for everything else. The environment was an issue she cared deeply about, and she knew her stance wasn't always easy for others to understand. Still, she was resolute in her belief that the path forward must be sustainable, not just for the planet, but for the people living on it. I recognize the urgency of climate change, she began, her voice firm and steady. I know that the time for action is now. The science is clear, and the impacts are already being felt. But I also understand that we cannot solve this problem by simply throwing away the jobs and livelihoods of millions of people who rely on industries like oil and gas. We need a plan that doesn't leave entire communities behind. She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd, looking for any sign of understanding, or at least a willingness to listen. I support a gradual transition to renewable energy, but this needs to be done in a way that is equitable, practical, and doesn't sacrifice the well-being of workers or families who depend on these industries. We cannot afford to suddenly eliminate fossil fuels without providing viable alternatives. People's lives are at stake. Dr. Sharp, arms crossed and eyes narrowed, wasn't satisfied with the answer. But surely, Representative Matthews, that approach doesn't account for the speed at which climate change is progressing. Every delay, every concession to the fossil fuel industry puts us further behind. You're prioritizing the short-term economic gain over long-term planetary survival. Rebecca took a deep breath. I'm not denying the urgency, but we cannot force such a drastic change without causing unintended harm. We need innovation, not just regulation. We need to support green technologies, renewable energy sources, and infrastructure that can replace the outdated systems. But we must also ensure that people aren't left behind in the process. A few students nodded thoughtfully, their expressions mixed. Others remained doubtful, but Rebecca felt a small sense of accomplishment. She had made her case, and though she knew it wouldn't change everyone's mind, the conversation was moving forward, not stuck in a cycle of shouting matches. I believe we can have both, Rebecca continued. We can protect our planet and our economy, but it will require collaboration, compromise, and a long-term vision. That's what I'm working toward, and that's what we need to demand from our leaders. She looked around the room, hoping that her words had at least planted a seed of doubt in the minds of the staunchest critics. There was still much work to do, but she had no intention of giving up on the fight for a sustainable future that included everyone. The next question came from a man in the back of the auditorium, a professor from the political science department. His voice was low, but carried the weight of years spent studying foreign relations. Representative Matthews, he said, his gaze piercing, you've supported military interventions in the past, yet there is a growing movement that argues such actions only perpetuate violence, destabilize regions, and cost countless lives. How do you justify the U.S. military's role in conflicts around the world? Rebecca's heart skipped a beat. This was the tough one. The issue of military interventions was always fraught with complexity and emotion. It was personal for so many, especially for those who had seen the effects of war firsthand. Rebecca herself had witnessed the cost of military intervention during her time in the service. The memories of her comrades lost in battle, the families torn apart by war, weighed heavily on her. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I understand why many people question the necessity of military intervention, she said, her voice softer now, as if acknowledging the weight of the question. I've been to the places where we've fought. I've seen the consequences. But I also know that sometimes military intervention is necessary to prevent atrocities, to protect innocent people from genocides, and to maintain global stability. The room was silent, the students listening closely to her every word. Rebecca could feel the eyes on her, their skepticism palpable, but she wasn't going to back down. She had lived through the pain of war, and it had shaped her beliefs. The reality is, she continued, sometimes diplomacy and sanctions are not enough. When lives are at stake, when entire populations are facing oppression, we cannot sit idly by and watch. It's not always perfect. It's not always the solution we hope for. But if we don't act, we risk the consequences of doing nothing. Rebecca glanced at the professor, his brow furrowed in thought. I'm not here to glorify war. I've lost too many friends to ever do that. But I also understand that our military presence in certain regions has prevented worse atrocities. We've saved lives, even when it's come at a cost. The professor leaned forward, his voice trembling with emotion. My brother died in Vietnam, he said quietly. He was just a boy, a casualty of a war that seemed pointless. How can you justify the military's actions when people like my brother suffer? Rebecca's throat tightened, the pain in the professor's voice cutting through the tension in the room. She knew this wasn't just a theoretical debate for him. It was deeply personal. She paused, her eyes softening as she spoke from the heart. I can't imagine the pain of losing a loved one in war. I've seen the cost of conflict up close, and I carry that burden every day. But we must also recognize that sometimes, the military's role isn't about seeking conflict. It's about preventing something worse. I wish it didn't have to be that way, but the world isn't always black and white. The professor looked down, his shoulders slumping, as if the weight of her words had finally broken through the armor of his anger. Rebecca could feel the shift in the room. The students were no longer just watching her. They were listening, really listening, and that, she knew, was the first step toward understanding. The conversation was painful, raw, and uncomfortable, but it was also necessary. Rebecca hoped that, by the end of the day, the students might leave with a different perspective, not just on her, but on the complexity of the issues that shaped their world. As the tension lingered in the room, Rebecca knew it was time to share something personal, something that might help bridge the chasm of misunderstanding. Professor Roth's earlier words about losing his brother in Vietnam had struck a chord deep inside her. She had lost comrades, too, many in fact, and some of them had made the ultimate sacrifice. This wasn't just about policies or political disagreements. This was about human lives, the pain of loss, and the reality of war. I understand your pain, Professor Roth, Rebecca began, her voice quieter now, tinged with the weight of experience. I've stood on the edge of war, looking into the eyes of young men and women who left everything behind, family, dreams, and safety, to protect a cause they believed in. I've lost friends, some of them more than friends, to the horrors of war. And one of those losses still haunts me every day. The room, which had been full of heated energy, fell into an uneasy silence. Everyone leaned in, sensing the shift. Rebecca took a deep breath, her memories taking her back to Afghanistan, to a moment she could never forget. There was a mission I was on in Kabul, she continued, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. We were tasked with rescuing a group of children who had been taken by a group of insurgents. It was a dangerous mission, one that we knew might cost lives, but the children were innocent. They were caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't understand. They had no voice, and we had to be their voice. Rebecca paused, her eyes distant as she relived the moment in vivid detail. We fought our way through the enemy lines, and we were close, so close to getting the children to safety. But as we were making our escape, one of my comrades, Sergeant Thompson, saw a child who had been separated from the group. He could have kept running, gotten to safety, but instead, he turned back. He ran toward that child, and he gave his life to save that little girl. The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Rebecca's throat tightened, and she forced herself to look up, meeting the eyes of the students who had been so quick to judge her earlier. Sergeant Thompson died to save a child, and in that moment, I knew that what we were doing, what we were fighting for, was not in vain. We weren't just soldiers following orders. We were people, human beings, trying to make the world a better place, even in the midst of chaos. There was a long, painful silence in the room as Rebecca's story sank in. She could see it in the eyes of the students. Some of them were no longer angry or hostile. They were softening. Some looked visibly moved, while others appeared to be reflecting on their own beliefs about war and sacrifice. I'm not asking you to agree with everything I've said today, Rebecca continued, her voice still heavy with emotion. But I want you to understand this. Every decision we make, every military action, it's never as simple as it seems. There are lives at stake, real lives, people who will never have the chance to tell their side of the story. And sometimes, in the face of unimaginable circumstances, the military is the only thing that stands between life and death. Her gaze moved across the room, meeting the eyes of those who had once been her harshest critics. She could see that, for the first time, they were beginning to see her as more than just a politician. They were seeing the woman who had lived through the difficult, sometimes heartbreaking choices that shaped her views. And the sacrifice of people like Sergeant Thompson, she continued softly, will never be forgotten. It's why I stand here today. It's why I fight for policies that protect innocent lives, not just in our country, but in every corner of the world. The silence stretched on, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with a sense of understanding, of shared humanity. Rebecca felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this conversation had done more than she had expected. It had opened hearts, softened minds, and allowed her to connect with an audience she had once feared might never understand her. As the debate came to an end, Rebecca stood quietly at the front of the room, her mind racing. She had faced fierce opposition, difficult questions, and moments where she wasn't sure she could hold her ground. But now, as the room began to empty, she could sense a shift, a subtle change. Some students who had once been vocal in their criticism approached her, their faces softened, and they spoke in quieter, more respectful tones. One of the young women who had been among the loudest protesters earlier in the debate now hesitated before speaking. I didn't agree with everything you said, she admitted, her voice uncertain. But your story, it made me think. I never really considered what it's like to be in your position. I guess I was too quick to judge. Rebecca smiled, a small, knowing smile that spoke of understanding. That's all I'm asking for, she replied gently. For all of us to listen, to really listen. We may not always agree, but that doesn't mean we can't understand each other. As the crowd thinned out, Rebecca stood alone for a moment, looking out at the empty auditorium. She felt a sense of weariness, but also a deep sense of satisfaction. She had faced her critics, told her truth, and in doing so, had opened a door for future conversations. Not every student had changed their mind. Not every skeptic had been won over. But there was something more important than simply winning arguments. It was the willingness to engage in dialogue, to acknowledge the humanity of the other side. On the flight back to Washington, Rebecca stared out the window, her mind reflecting on the day. She knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But she was hopeful. She had done her part to spark a conversation, to make a connection. And that, she believed, was where change began. As the plane touched down in Washington, Rebecca felt a renewed sense of purpose. The country was divided, yes, but if she could engage with even a handful of people, show them the power of respectful dialogue, then perhaps there was hope after all. The conversation, she knew, had only just begun. As Rebecca left the airport and stepped into the bustling streets of Washington, the weight of the day lingered, but it no longer felt as heavy. She had faced fierce opposition, had been challenged in ways she hadn't expected, and had shared parts of her soul that were hard to speak of. But, in return, she had seen something extraordinary. The beginning of understanding, the flicker of empathy where once there had been only judgment. In the midst of the debates, the protests, and the harsh words, Rebecca had learned one fundamental truth. Real change doesn't happen through forceful victories or loud confrontations. It happens when people listen, really listen, and allow themselves to see the humanity in others, even when their views seem worlds apart. It happens when we take a moment to pause, reflect, and acknowledge that our experiences shape who we are, and that, sometimes, those experiences are more complicated than we might have first imagined. Rebecca knew that the road ahead would still be long and filled with challenges. There would be more debates, more difficult questions, and more moments where she would feel the weight of the divide between people. But as she walked through the streets of Washington, she felt a renewed sense of hope, one grounded in the belief that change is possible if we are brave enough to start the conversation. The next time she stood in front of an audience, whether they agreed with her or not, she would carry with her the lessons from that day. The power of sharing her story, the importance of humility, and the realization that listening might just be the most revolutionary act of all. As she moved forward, Rebecca knew that while she couldn't change the world overnight, she could keep showing up, keep listening, and keep speaking from the heart. Because in the end, that was how true change was made. Not with grand gestures, but with small acts of understanding that rippled outward, one conversation at a time. Thank you so much for watching and sticking with the story until the end. I hope you enjoyed the journey and found meaning in the messages shared. If you liked the video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss any future videos. Feel free to share it with your friends and family if you think they'd enjoy it too. Thanks again, and I look forward to bringing you more stories in the future.